Hello and welcome to this episode of Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. Now we bring you this episode amid fighting in Ukraine. A war many had hoped would not happen, but has broken out nonetheless. As we speak, and I'll be very honest and say that there is very little concrete and verifiable information on what is happening on the ground. Reports indicate that Russian missiles have hit military installations at key cities in Ukraine and that their land troops have entered Ukrainian territory from at least two directions. President Putin has said that the purpose of the operation is to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has declared a state of emergency. The European countries and the United States are set to impose a wide series of sanctions. The next few hours and days may see a massive change in the global order, with many observers calling it a major turning point in the way the world is structured. While what is happening on the ground is still unclear, the why is perhaps a bit more comprehensible. We have with us Prabir Purkayasa to talk a bit more about this. So Prabir, first of all, like I said, there are a lot of things that are unclear. There's claims, counterclaims, information warfare, all of that happening. But very broadly, what do you think are the contours of what is happening on the ground?
First is, of course, we did not really expect the timing of what has happened. We thought that Putin had made his move, recognizing the two republics over there, the Donetsk and Lugansk, and sending peacekeepers, as he had said, recognizing at that time itself the Donbass boundaries within which these republics should be allowed to be there. So there was already this issue about the two-thirds of Donbass region which is under Ukrainian control, which these two republics were claiming. But this move has, honestly speaking, not something we anticipated, because we thought Donbass was the target immediately. And this, we thought, if it happens, will happen after negotiations, etc. takes place. And it is shown that it is not bearing fruit. Maybe at that point of time Russia will do something. Putin seems to have not made a chess move as we thought earlier. This time he's really upturned the board. So we really have a completely new scenario on our hands in which a military action has been taken. Two things stand out in this: that Ukraine never had the ability to resist Russian military. They have said that we have neutralized the air defenses. That's a very strong statement. And we have actually also made their airports essentially non-functional, meaning that attacks cannot take place from there. This seems to have been their immediate strategic objective inside Ukraine. So that is one part of it. Now, again, this also shows that neither Ukraine nor NATO had the ability to stop Russia militarily if it did intervene, which it now has done. So therefore, why either Ukraine or NATO would not, or the other countries in NATO, would not negotiate? Instead of that, Stoltenberg, the NATO head, kept on saying the sovereign right of any country to do whatever it wants. All of that, which did not meet what would be the geostrategic reality in Ukraine, why other countries did not actually address the issues that Putin was raising, that if you put NATO missiles over there, if you put possibly even nuclear weapons over there, you do military exercises within Ukraine, even if they're not a part of Ukraine, if they're not a part of NATO, all of this is on a collision course with us, because we will not accept the strategic danger that you inflict. It's 4 to 5 minutes with a hypersonic weapon. It's about 7 to 10 minutes with other missiles to Moscow. This we cannot accept will happen in Ukraine. This is not very dissimilar to what, for instance, the United States had done vis-a-vis Cuba. If you remember, when missiles were there in Cuba, this is the exact argument that they had given. So the question is, did Ukraine have the ability to prevent it? No. Did NATO have the ability to prevent this attack? No. So why would not then they look at trying to settle this issue through discussions and at least an attempt to address some of the concerns that Russia had? Instead of that, they went on talking about sanctions. In this, Zelensky made one, I thought, cardinal error, which was to talk about nuclear weapons, that Ukraine can again start building nuclear weapons. They have 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and therefore, yes, they have the ability to build nuclear weapons, possibly. and they also had a good missile technology capability. Maybe they could revive that as well. So this poses immediately a bigger danger to Russia. So I think this is the reason that they have intervened militarily as they have now. And yes, it's a big issue because you violated the sovereignty of a country. That's absolutely correct. And therefore, this is something which under international law is not correct. But given the background that is there, this I think is something which should have been foreseen. Now, the question that you have asked, what is the situation on the ground? I think the air defense has been neutralized, it appears to be, and therefore Russia does control the skies. And if that is so, they strategically then do control the ground. As of now, we don't see any major march of troops or tank coming into Ukraine in a very, shall we say, visible way. So we have to wait and watch what happens. At the moment, it seems to be largely being fought on the ground. The strategic objective could be Odessa, Mariupol, that region, and taking over the rest of Donbass. That could be. I do not think even Russia would be foolish enough to try and keep Ukraine under military control, physical operations that get in over there. How they're going to denazify, that's an open question.
Prabir, in this context, the other question a lot of people are talking about, you also hinted at that, is whether this could have been avoided in the first place. Like you said, one option was that if the NATO countries, if Ukraine, United States had taken Putin's concerns seriously enough and there had been, so is there an alternate timeline where this could actually have happened?
I don't think that the US and the NATO allies really thought that after all the threats they were making, Russia would still go ahead and do it. I thought they overestimated their ability to inflict pain on Russia without realizing that Russia, when it comes to a strategic issue of this order, where they think their existence can be threatened by nuclear weapons in Ukraine or missiles in Ukraine, that this is something which is really not acceptable to them, and that they would then be willing to face all the sanctions that is there for what they see as their right to their safety, security and existence. So, of course, Ukraine can say the same. So this cuts both ways.
Right.
But nevertheless, the fact is they have nuclear weapons. They are one of the foremost military powers in the world. After the United States, certainly Germany, France, UK are not strategic players in this game. So given that Russian concerns should have been seen more seriously, yes, there was possibly a window of opportunity. Because if you remember, Americans started saying that 3 months back, invasion is coming, date. They have been saying it for more than a year now. So if that is true, then they had 1 year, if not 1 year, 3 months at least to realize that something serious is going to happen. Their only weapon seems to have been threats of sanctions.
Right.
And sanctions, and we can discuss why, sanctions have limited play when it comes to existence of the strategic security of a country. So if that is so, they would not back off by the threat of sanctions. And as I said, the threat of nuclear weapons, which is what Zelensky actually made after coming back from Munich, actually also would be a very important destabilizing element. And it's also the other part of it that the Nazi forces in Ukraine, they have street power. They don't have political power in terms of large-scale support, but they have street power, unless, of course, this invasion changes that. So they have the street power to not let any resolution take place with Russia. So that, they had said, if Zelensky reaches any agreement on Donbass, then we'll pull him down.
Right.
And that kind of street power they showed in Maidan itself, when they actually made change the government, essentially, without a formal vote, without any legal transition. It was the street power that changed the government. So given that situation, I think Russia has decided that there is very little leeway with Zelensky. He's not his own man. Between the United States and the street power of the fascist forces that are there in Ukraine, you have the Azov battalion, you have the right sector, a whole lot of other bunch of crazies running around there. very cozy with the Canadians, the British Army who were training them, as well as the United States. So all of this, Russia has taken into account that he has two problems in Ukraine. One is the security one, other is the kind of politics in Ukraine, which he thinks he can control through this measure, which I doubt very much. So I think he's chosen a path which is quite dangerous for the world as well, because, Ukraine is not a small country.
Exactly.
It's a country of 40 million people. It's the second largest state in Europe. So it's a large piece of land with a lot of people. Yes, it is facing a huge issues in terms of its economy and in terms of demographic collapse of a certain kind. But nevertheless, it is something which is a big force, even in its decline and its, shall we say, in its dysfunctional order, which what it is now.
Right.
So what Russia will do is on this, how it will address it, I don't know. One thing is, yes, I don't think nuclear weapons are coming to Ukraine or NATO is coming to Ukraine. I don't think that is likely to happen as a result of this. But will they have a huge dysfunctional state on its border? And will that instability then leak into Russia? These are, I think, open questions.
Or for that matter, Western Europe as well.
Well, that's a bigger question which Western Europe should have actually thought about, because if you take the kind of fascist forces which are there in Ukraine, they have a lot of sympathy in Germany, France and other places. So when you see the rise of a right-wing fascist forces across Europe, we have Poland, we have Romania, you have Hungary, you have the Baltic states. There is a lot of crazies out there.
Right.
So if you put all of it together, Ukraine actually could nucleate a much bigger headache for the Western Europe as well. Again, that's something which I don't think both the Europeans or the Americans have really thought through.
Right. Thank you so much, Prabir. We'll hopefully have you tomorrow as well to see what's continuously happening on the ground. So we already saw what's happening on the ground, the large geopolitical situation, but a key question with respect to this crisis is also that of the economy. And this is not only of the economy of Russia and Ukraine, or Europe for that matter, but the entire world. We talked to senior journalist Anindya Chakravarti on this issue. Anindya, thank you so much for joining us. So, of course, the first sign immediately after this conflict was that the Brent crude oil prices have crossed $100, the first time since 2014. Now, this was an issue many people were worried about. So, how do you see the immediate economic impact, especially in the next couple of days? Sanctions are going to be announced most probably today evening itself. So, how do you see things panning out?
It's a very difficult thing to predict, Prashant, because on the face of it, prices have gone up. And if you look at what the media is saying, especially the financial media, then you see that they're talking about oil prices at 150, 170 to a dollar, not even 100, right? These are figures that we haven't seen for a very, very long time or even heard of in a very, very long time. But one has to remember that actually these oil prices are not real people buying barrels of oil. These are speculation by traders, by oil traders. It is often in their interest, especially if they're holding oil futures, to push the prices up. So they look for these pretexts to push prices up. Having said that, there is no doubt that there will be some disruptions, because till now, I think the sanctions have been phase by phase, right?
Right.
One doesn't know what the next move is going to be. One has to remember that I think Russia is probably about 7 to 8% of US oil imports comes from Russia, right? I think right after Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. And it is one of the biggest suppliers of natural gas in the world. So if you look at Russia, it is the third largest supplier of oil and the second largest supplier of natural gas. China and Russia, US are heavily dependent on Russian oil. It's not as if that it goes away and suddenly, nothing changes. It does change, especially since what happens is that the oil that US itself produces, that becomes expensive again, right? The US is a big oil producer. It has big an industry of shale oil, which is out there, which made oil prices drop sharply. As oil prices go up, shale oil production will increase because of this. So maybe there is a barrier to the amount that oil prices can go up, because shale oil production will increase internationally. And there's also I think it's called the Vienna, the treaty, which is supposed, the conference which is supposed to happen, where there might be a deal worked out with Iran. And if that
Right.
happens, then supplies from Iran might increase. So there are ways to counterbalance. Now, the problem that the US faces right now is that it has a very high inflation, right?
Right.
It has very high inflation. Oil prices have already shot up at gas stations, which is our petrol pumps. They call it gas station. And there is a limit beyond which the US government will not want oil prices to go up because it has a direct inflationary impact. So one has to watch out in what calibrated manner that the Biden administration is going to deal with these sanctions. Part of the supplies from the USSR will have to continue. And if, let's say, the ex-USSR, so Russia, right, will have to continue, right? And I think USSR is relevant in this context because of Ukraine. Now, as we know that the region where those two republics have been recognized by Putin, one of those places there, right, one of the ports there, which was actually taken over at one time by neo-Nazi volunteers, right, at one time, who have now been regularized in the Ukrainian National Guard. That particular port, if Russian troops enter and take it over, right, then it actually opens up a lot of routes for Russian supplies into different parts of Europe and the former Soviet bloc and large parts of Eastern Europe. And whether that will be reinstated, we don't know. Now, the problem is that it could well be what the Soviet Union faced in Afghanistan, because we know that the US has openly admitted and said that they will support, insurgency in Ukraine, in the parts of Ukraine, if it is demilitarized, which has happened, or Russian army comes and sits there, they're going to support insurgency. Many of it is right-wing insurgency, neo-Nazi insurgency, as we know. And if that happens, then this could be a very long war, right? This might not just end in the way we thought it would. And it could be, Russia might have a huge price to pay in just maintaining its army there, taking a lot of, the takeover is easy, but after that, what happens? It's a bit like the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, where moving in is almost overnight, but after that, what happens, right? So the effect on global economy, especially inflation because of oil prices, supply disruptions, that could be long drawn out, difficult to predict immediately.
And in this case, context also, a lot of people thinking about India as well, because India, at the end of the two COVID-19 waves especially, had suffered a massive economic crisis. And a lot of India's policy prescriptions, a lot of India's policy decisions have been really based on on oil price itself, because that is a very key aspect of how even a recovery, for instance, is planned for. So if we have a major increase, this recovery itself could be affected. So how do you see Indian policymakers dealing with this? Also considering the fact that they're caught anyway geopolitically between Russia and the US in this specific crisis.
I think one of the biggest things one has to remember is that from around one of the great, fortune that Narendra Modi had when he became prime minister was that oil prices began to crash. So we had a very long period of benign oil prices, which helped the government build a buffer, right? Which it could use without expanding at least on the books, the fiscal deficit, to provide a lot of different kinds of dole and handouts, right? If you look at the Modi government's expenditure, which was on FCI's books for a long time, on food subsidy, on Manrega, it was much more than what the UPA did, even if you adjust for inflation. That was largely because it had that buffer of high taxes from oil that it could take and use to, in effect, buy votes, as we see in what is happening in Uttar Pradesh, the state of India, northern state of India, where elections are taking place right now, where directly an appeal is being made that we gave you rice, we gave you this, so give us votes, right? Now, when oil prices go up, what happens? Do you pass it on entirely to consumers? Do you pass it on entirely to the economy? Because remember, diesel, farmers use it. It's the largest part of transport. Petrol is used by the middle class, whether we like it or not. And when you pass it on, what happens? So I think if oil prices shoot up, there will be no option but to for excise duty cuts, right?
Right.
Cuts on taxes on petroleum. And if that happens, then the government loses a large chunk of its tax revenues, which it has been getting. And this is a huge problem for, I would say, the government, because the policies it has followed, which has helped it win elections. The BJP win elections in many places, which is give dole to the poorest of the poor, while giving tax cut to the richest of the rich, right? I don't know how long they can continue with that, and that could be a crisis, right? The UPA, one of the biggest problems the previous regime faced in India was inflation, and if that shoots up, then that is a problem. But that is entirely dependent on which way oil moves. 120, 130, 150, 60, it's a problem. It's not something that can just be written off.
Right. So conclusions basically are that there are two or three key aspects here. One is the duration of this conflict. It really is going to be one of the most important factors. So if you're looking at maybe a very short-term conflict where Putin makes his point and then withdraws Russian forces and there's some kind of negotiation, things might, there might be some return to equilibrium. On the other hand, if this is going to be a long drawn-out conflict, things might really deteriorate, not only in India, but also, for instance, in Europe, where high energy prices could lead to a massive amount of resentment as well.
And the US, which is facing a massive inflation problem right now. That is
Absolutely.
what the Biden administration faces right now. Putin, I think, has given a way out. He's kind of said that Ukraine should voluntarily reject offer, NATO's offer to join
NATO's membership, right?
And that could be maybe a way out of this crisis, while the US continues to actually de facto keep Ukraine in the NATO, because as you know that the US funds Ukraine's army. It provides what is called lethal training for defensive purposes, right? So it has all these things that is there. Huge amounts of money have been provided, and in a lot of ways it directs Ukrainian army and paramilitary forces directly. So whether this formality is required, in a sense, maybe Putin will want that face-saving gesture and also give a face-saving gesture to Biden and the West. In that process, Ukraine might get a bit crushed, but I don't know whether the West right now can afford to have a Russia which is under sanctions and therefore not able to sell oil, and which then affects them. There might be a global consensus. They might put pressure on Saudi Arabia to increase production. US shale oil might be subsidized by the government and allowed to increase, and that might keep prices down. But I don't know how long that is feasible.
Right. Thank you so much, Arundhati, for joining us. And that's all we have time for today. We'll be continuing our coverage of Ukraine and some of the major issues around it tomorrow as well. Until then, keep watching People's Dispatch.